Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Sam Spieler and Eyad.
Hey.
Hello again.
Good evening. Today we are continuing our series on the impossibility of a new home, novels about immigrants trying to make a life for themselves in a new place. We're reading W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz. This will be a spoiler-free discussion, so feel free to listen to us before reading the book. If you'd like to join our text discussion, you can find our book club on Reddit by clicking on the link in the episode description. And you can also support us in your local bookstore by using our bookshop.org link, which is also in our episode description. We are on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will have an in-depth discussion of this book with spoilers. So we hope you'll join us for that episode as well. I guess there are spoilers here, but not really, like one or two spoilers, right?
I don't think that it really matters. I think that the story is how the story is told rather than what actually happens.
Yes, an Eyad pick.
Yes, this is definitely an Eyad pick.
Those are the markings of an Eyad pick?
Maybe. I mean, you guys can probably say better than I can, but I do think that this is definitely one of those books that I couldn't imagine being a Sam pick, that's for sure.
Well, there are elements of people being victimized.
I don't always just pick victimization stories.
A little Sam flavor here and there.
I mean, it is about a Jew, so there's that. I guess I should say that I'm Jewish.
No, this is where you tell us that you're German.
Right.
So, yeah, why don't you tell us why you ended up picking this book? What is it about this book that stood out to you?
Really, I don't think it was this book so much as it was this author. Sebald is one of those authors that people talk about in tones of reverence. I feel like the people who know him really have lots of praise for him. And I felt like this series, particularly talking about immigration, was the perfect way to begin reading his work. This is actually the first novel that I've read from him, so I thought this was a great opportunity to dive in. Sebald was a German novelist and poet. He's known as WG on the dust jackets, but his full name is Winfried Georg Sebald, and apparently his friends called him Max. He wanted to be Max because he thought that his real name was too close to the woman's name Winifred. So I guess he was kind of self-conscious about being too feminine or something. He grew up in Germany, and he was educated there in Switzerland and England. And he lived for the last 30 years of his life as a professor at the University of East Anglia. He began publishing novels and poetry in German starting in the late 1980s, but he only really became globally known in the 1990s, in the late 90s, when his work was translated into English. And like I mentioned, that work was very highly acclaimed, and people were admiring him, even talking about him getting a Nobel Prize. But he unfortunately only was able to enjoy that attention very briefly because sadly he died in 2001 at age 57.
University of East Anglia.
Yes.
Go fighting cloud dogs. That's their mascot. They're cloud dogs.
What is a cloud dog?
A cloud dog is the poofy dog you imagine when you think of the phrase cloud dog. A dog in the shape of a cloud.
So when you think of a cloud dog, that's what a cloud dog is.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay.
Gotcha.
So another reason why this is an Eyad pick, I think, is because the style is quite influenced by Sam and James's favorite author, Thomas Bernhard. I don't know if that was a problem for you guys in this book, because I know that you were not especially big fans when we were reading the Limeworks a few weeks ago. The novel tells the story of the protagonist Jacques Austerlitz. He is an architectural historian, and he discovers that he was sent to Britain on the Kindertransport as a young Jewish boy in 1939 to avoid the Nazi occupation of continental Europe. Only later in his life does he begin to make efforts to come to terms with this past and try to understand more about his previously unknown origins.
One thing I'll add is there is a narrator in the book, but that narrator is not Austerlitz. So it's kind of like Gatsby, where the narrator is not the protagonist.
Yes, I think that the narrator in Austerlitz recedes even further into the distance than in Gatsby. Like, this narrator is really almost just a receptacle for stories. Some people think that the narrator is Sebald himself. I'm not too sure if that's the case, but I don't think that he's a particularly important figure. I think Jacques Austerlitz himself is really the star of the show.
Yeah, the narrator is mainly in the novel to create the shape of the story, to provide another filter for the reader. I don't think the narrator actually really influences the story in any way, except in the shaping of it.
I'll start basically by saying that I really enjoyed this novel. It wasn't an easy read, but I think it was a really good read. It's a very human novel, and it's very historically engaged, and it invites the reader to understand trauma and how trauma in the past can be inherited, unknowingly inherited, and how that trauma can duplicate itself within a human mind. And that, to me, I think is a really unique subject matter that I hadn't seen approached in fiction before.
I agree. This was very unique. When I started it, it definitely felt like an Eyad pick. And as such, it was difficult for me to get into, but I enjoyed this as well. It's very moving, but in a kind of gut-wrenching way. It's sad, but it's not sad in this kind of false way. It's not put on.
It's the kind of book where you kind of just need to let yourself be immersed in it
Yes.
and feel the atmosphere of the book, of the story being told. And the atmosphere is that, for me, one of kind of the remains of Europe. Because he's this professor of historical architecture, he describes a lot of architecture. And the way he describes architecture is not really the way a tour guide might, but rather someone who's describing the bones of a society, and not bones of a living society so much as the remains of a society. To me, that's what it's like when Austerlitz talks about the buildings. It's kind of like the remains of what had happened before. So that's the kind of atmosphere you get from the book. It's gloomy, I'd say. It's gloomy, but I don't think it makes me feel depressed. It just really puts you in that way of thinking about the world, about looking at Europe, especially in that way.
Everything in this book has purpose. At the beginning, it feels like it's wandering around, and Austerlitz is talking about these castles and fortresses in this different way, I'll say. Like you said, it's more like he's describing the remains of a long dead beast. But that feeds into what the novel is about. That feeds into thematic concerns that keep coming back.
Right, because that's also who he is as a person. He's the remains of presumably a child who was more fully alive.
Right.
I think it requires a different kind of empathy than readers are probably used to being asked for these days, because the stakes in the novel are very different from a lot of other novels. We're not talking about life or death because these are people and things that have already died. And it's not even the life or death of a loved one, but it's the life or death of a stranger or a person that you didn't know until just now. So it asks something different from the reader, which I think it's difficult for the reader to understand that feeling at first because it's not something that happens frequently. It's, in my mind, a very human experience. It's not something I can imagine in any other context, but at the same time, it's a kind of experience that very few human beings will actually have. So in that sense, it's a challenging novel just to come to grips with the emotions that I think it's asking for. I will say that it's not a novel built for entertainment. This is not the sort of novel that you read for plot. It's not the sort of novel that you would even read for the beauty of the prose. It is well written, but not beautifully written. I think that there are passages, like Sam, you had mentioned, particularly at the beginning of the book, that feel aimless, but you have to understand the novel in retrospect. You have to finish the whole thing without knowing where you were going, and then you understand the purpose of the journey once you finished it.
Yeah, definitely. It feels very real to me, not just because he's describing things that may or may not have happened to people in the past, not just because he actually did stitch together accounts of real people's lives, but he feels like the right person to tell this kind of story, to tell the story of someone whose past is lost to them, someone who does not yet understand why they do the things they do.
Well, that's interesting to me. I hadn't really thought about that, but what do you mean by him being the right person to tell that story?
Well, the way you describe this prose, it's not built for entertainment. I can understand why you compared Sebald to Bernhard. They do have this long-winded way of writing, but they're very different writers. If Bernhard had tried to write this, the effect would have been much more depressing in this oddly dark way, whereas what we have is gloomy, but it's not morose or melancholy. It's thoughtful. Sadness comes from the reality of what is being discovered, the reality of Europe's past, not from pathos that the writer is just throwing in there.
I was grasping for a word, and I think thoughtful is really what makes it for me, Sam. So I'm glad you said thoughtful, because I was thinking about what is the difference between Bernhard and Sebald. Because I did not like Bernhard's style, even though I appreciate that he's making an artistic statement with his prose. I think the difference for me is the thoughtfulness that Sebald brings to it with respect to the subject matter at hand. I think Bernhard, and this isn't an episode about Bernhard, but I think Bernhard is so focused on his artistic expression that it is not really thoughtful in this way. There's very little nuance given to us. And what I really did enjoy about this book is I thought that Sebald had a really deft touch. His prose is very deliberate. And for me, the most impressive thing is he is able to present very resonant and affecting images. And these images kind of obliquely reveal or underscore an emotion or an idea. Like, for example, at the beginning of the book, he's describing the former fortress that ended up becoming a concentration camp, and he describes it like a crab. You know, it is actually a great image because it's not just a crab, it's like the carcass of the crab. And he shows you a picture as well of it, and you can kind of see the crab, and you can engage with what he's written or what he's presented to you in the photo in like different ways. You can think about that image and it works so well. That's something that's incredibly difficult to do because he's presenting an image that operates on a very subtle level and he doesn't hit you over the head with it. There's just enough meaning for you to grasp onto and kind of hold it in your hand and view it in different ways. There's another image early in the book about silkworms. It's something about like boiling silkworms. And he doesn't draw the connection for you, but you know it's about killing Jews. So he does that so well that when I finished the book, that's what I'm left with. I'm left very impressed by his ability to do this one very specific thing that honestly, I think he does better than almost anyone else I've read. So for me, that makes the book. I would argue that his writing is actually incredibly good in this one aspect. I think I did actually enjoy the book, even though it's not a book, as you said, Eyad, that's meant to be enjoyable.
I think that there are different levels of enjoyment. I mean, anything that you would choose to read is enjoyable in some respect. But I guess what I'm trying to point to here by saying that it's not enjoyable is that it's not pleasure so much as satisfaction, if there's a difference in your mind. Like, especially after finishing this book, I felt this sense of satisfaction. I felt like a unique and personal thought had been presented to me, and I had the opportunity to grasp something from Sebald's novel that is uncommon. And that to me is a satisfying experience. But the actual act of reading, which I tend to concentrate on, is not as pleasurable as it is, for example, when we're reading Parable of the Sower. I think that is a novel that's built for entertainment. It's built for pleasure. Here, there were times when actually I found myself kind of frustrated with this novel. And that doesn't mean that it's not good, but it's a novel that you have to work with rather than a novel that you just enjoy.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that the prose is not beautiful, and I would agree, but it has this kind of pastoral feeling at times, especially with the descriptions of places. What place means is very important to this novel. Not just how it looks and not just its history, but how the shape of it fits in with history and how history fits in with the shape of it and how those two things interact with memory too.
So when we say it's frustrating, I think what we mean is that the sentences are really long and the topic of conversation meanders and is fairly oblique, right? Like,
Yes.
do we agree? Like, that's what makes it frustrating. The subject at hand, what he's talking about, is not actually unclear. It's the way he comes at that topic that is very unclear. It's his prose and his sentences that are purposefully long and winding.
Well, especially at the beginning, like even knowing a little bit about it, I knew the basic overture of it. So knowing that it was extra frustrating because you're trying to get through these seemingly, well, like you say, meandering sections to get to the meat of it. But later you come to realize it's all meat. It's all feeding into this elaborate unfolding story.
Where it really picks up for me is probably about 2/5 through, where you get to the section in Prague.
Yes.
I think that's when it's actually very moving. The earlier sections, when he's at school, it's not actually especially interesting. And in the introduction that we all had in our copies, James Woods was like really going on and on about how he loves certain parts of the scenes in the school. And I just thought, I mean, that's kind of like typical James Woods, like being kind of pompous here. Because I just thought it was okay. Like, none of it was especially revealing or interesting to me. But the part that was interesting for me was when he gets to Prague, and then things start falling into place, and you see what he's actually trying to do here.
I think that what he's doing with a lot of the scenes, if you can even call them scenes, because I don't think that the novel is really divided using the typical scene work that most novelists would use, but with a lot of the description of events, they don't exist so much as meaningful and discrete events that work towards any larger theme necessarily, but more as texture. It is very realistic. I think Sam is right when he says that it's very realistic because it shows you a real person. It shows you a life that doesn't seem to be curated for the page. It seems to be a real life. And because it has that texture of real life, including things that seem irrelevant and aimless, it builds towards the pathos of the novel. It adds to the gravity of the novel because Austerlitz doesn't feel to be just a figure on the page.
Yes, though I will say the book is very structured in how this person's account is told. It feels like it's meandering, and especially in the beginning, like James says, when he's talking about his school years. But there are a lot of things in that section that do become important later. The photography is a big one, but just the way he reveals different people in his life and how he regards the people in his life, I think is important. It is mostly textural, though, as Eyad points out.
And in terms of something you mentioned earlier, yet about this not being entertainment, I think there was potential for Sebald to make it more entertaining because this is kind of a search for parents. There are plot hooks in here, but Sebald purposefully decided not to go that route. And I think that's a fine choice because that's not really the point of the book. The point is not to titillate the reader. I think as a reader, you are not meant while reading the book to really be wondering what happened to this person's parents because you know what happened to this person's parents. It's a known historical fact.
I feel like it was a very conscious decision, but that it was also the right decision. I think it would have been a very different book had this been, let's say, more adventurous.
Well, more plot focused.
Right.
And suspenseful.
Right. I think maybe it would have been more entertaining, but I don't think it would have been a better novel.
I don't think it would have been a better novel because I don't think that's the point of the novel. The point of the novel, once again, is not the question of, is he going to find his parents? The point of the novel is we know what happened to his parents, and it's this search. That's what's important, is like, because of the Holocaust, you have these remains of people who are searching, and that's the point. It's like seeing, once again, these still photos that are present in the book. I don't think we actually mentioned it much earlier, but there are still photos in the book. It gives you that same effect. Like, these people are kind of frozen in who they are. Like, they're perpetually searching because they've lost something. Like, it wouldn't work if you get some kind of resolution, like, the orchestral resolution of, oh, he finally found his parents and he finally was able to find out where her grave was or anything like that. That would actually ruin the book because the book is that still photo of these people who are perpetually in search of something that's been lost and they cannot find it.
I would agree. I think that the novel shows you a particular kind of pain, and to show that pain being relieved in some way would just feel too glib. This is a real pain that exists for some people, and to act like this is a problem to be solved would almost in some sense be disrespectful to those people's memory.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of story where arguably the protagonist does not even know his real name until he's old enough to realize how odd it would be to not even know your own name.
All right, well, that was fun. Let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about who might enjoy reading this novel. Just fun-loving people, that's who. We are back. So who would you recommend Austerlitz to?
This is tough because this is a book for a very specific kind of reader. Outside of this podcast, if I had read this book, I might not even recommend it to you, Sam. Like, I would say, oh, this isn't really a Sam kind of book. It's a very difficult novel. I think even myself, if I had read this when I was younger, I wouldn't have understood it in the way that I understand it now. So it's an adult novel in the sense that you do need some life experience to really get some of the more important themes. And it's a challenging novel. And as I said, that it requires a certain kind of empathy that I think is uncommon these days.
Yeah, this is not a beach read by any means. It's it's the kind of book that I would want most people to read, but I agree that I don't think a lot of people have the ability to read this kind of book. I wouldn't even say that people lack the empathy needed necessarily, but there's a patience that must go along with that empathy, and that patience is rewarded. It's not just a worthwhile book. It's important, and I think the way it approaches this telling of trauma is very unique. And I think just that alone is really worth everyone's time. But I don't know how many people will seek out this book.
I'll answer it in kind of a different way because my background is in creative writing. I think if I could hand this book to an aspiring young writer, someone who is really trying to figure out how to play around with the tools of narration, how to tell a story in different ways, if I were to hand this book to that person and say, hey, read this book because the way it's telling a story is really important, and you probably haven't read novels like this before. Just read it and try to figure out why he's telling the story in this way. I think if you are armed with that kind of quest or mission as a reader, then you will really appreciate this book because this book actually, on the craft level, is actually very strong and very interesting and makes you think, like makes you question, why is this person doing this? And the answer to that question, why is Sebald doing this, is because all of it works together in the telling of this particular story. So for me, you can give this book to more people. I would say more people than you guys are saying, but I would say you have to give them a directive of some sort. You have to say, when you read this book, think about this. Because without that kind of direction, I think it's hard to understand this book unless you're like a trained close reader or someone who, as you said, has a certain kind of perspective. I think you can give that perspective to people by giving them some kind of discussion question.
Basically, give them this book and then tell them to listen to this podcast.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I mean, yeah, it works as assigned reading, but most books can be assigned. I think that you're right that an aspiring writer can learn a lot about craft from it, but if we're just talking about the kind of person who could just pick this up and read this and enjoy it without that kind of mandate to understand or to think thoughtfully about it, I don't think that there's a lot of people out there who would go looking for this book and enjoy it in the same way they would enjoy a lot of other books. Because, compared to even like Signs Preceding the End of the World, it doesn't even get political in the sense that it allows you to feel that kind of righteous anger.
Right.
There are no strong emotions that I think even thoughtful readers now are looking for. I think a lot of readers nowadays are looking for anger. They're looking to feel smart. They're looking to criticize the people that they want to criticize.
Sam books, yeah.
This book doesn't give in to any of that. It just says, look, this is obviously a very loaded way to express it, but I think Sebald is just trying to say, look, this is the way it happened. I am not going to magnify it. I'm not going to hide anything, but you have to do the work, I guess. You don't get the easy satisfaction that you get with a lot of other books.
Well, I don't remember if I used this word before, but it's very unsentimental. And I think that is kind of going toward what you're talking about. There is a lot of emotion behind these words, but it's not the kind of emotion that is plain on the page. It's things that you have to read into, things you have to dig into to understand what Sebald is saying.
Yes. I think that's exactly it. Like, I think a lot of readers nowadays, they just want that righteous anger. They want somebody to tell them it's okay to be angry. This is the time when you should feel angry.
Yeah, that's one of the byproducts of having this kind of narrative framing is it's kind of like testimony. You're just presented with evidence, specifically evidence of one person's life in this story, Austerlitz. So Sebald just gives it to you and then tells you, figure out what to feel about this or what to think about this. And on the thinking level, I think he presents, as I said earlier, a lot of images that kind of shape the way you view it and think about it. But on the feeling level, I don't think he gives you all that much. He gives you that atmosphere, but that's about it. And then he just lets you go with it and think about it and feel it on your own. But there are moments in the book that I think do elicit strong feelings, like, the section in Prague, for example.
It felt to me like a much older style. And I had to keep reminding myself, and he does mention the 90s in the book, but I had to kind of remind myself that it's as recent as the 1990s when this was written. There's something about the style feels very, maybe it's European, but it also just feels very honest. There's no irony.
Yeah, this is, I think what you're talking about is a trademark of his work. He writes in a very antiquated sort of German, and I think it's to Anthea Bell's credit. She's the English translator, that it reads the same way when you read it in English. It does feel like a 19th century novel. It doesn't feel at home in our postmodern era. Like, I think it is a postmodern novel in a sense, but it's much more quietly one than most of the other postmodern novels that I've read, at least.
And it was making me think too about the kinds of people that would enjoy this. While I enjoyed it, I feel like most of the people I would recommend it to, if not people that I knew were invested readers or, as James said, writers, I would be more comfortable recommending this to older people, because I feel like what I said earlier about patience is a big thing. And I feel like what Eyad was saying about readers today, there isn't as much patience going into most books for the younger reader, I guess I should say.
Something I just want to briefly mention, and you just brought it up, Eyad, is the translation is really good here. And I especially like the fact that the translator knew how good she was and didn't need to write a short passage at the end telling us how great of a job she did and how difficult it was because his style was so complicated. Which is something that I brought up in Herrera's book. I actually thought like she did a great job. When I finished reading this book, it was as if it was not translated. It was as if like he wrote it in English. And then I found out that he actually did help her like in the translation because he taught in England. So I'm sure his English is pretty good. But yeah, like the translation might be one of the best translations I've read for our podcast.
All right. So I think I've convinced you guys. Do you guys want to read more Sebald?
Were you trying to convince us?
Well, just because, as I had said several times, this is an Eyad pick, and it sounds like you enjoyed this novel. So would you read more?
Well, I definitely would read more Sebald than I would, I don't even remember the guy's name, Bernhard.
Bernhard?
Yeah, like this is way better than Bernhard. Way better.
I'd agree, but I don't feel like I need to even compare them. Yeah, I would definitely read more Sebald.
I actually am surprised. It's not just you yet. I know a lot of people compare the two. It's not all that similar, aside from the fact that they write really long sentences and long paragraphs. Like, it's not really similar.
Yeah, I guess not. But the method of storytelling is a little bit similar in that you're seeing a story told by one person through another person through another person.
Yeah.
we're getting a history that is Austerlitz's history, but it's also other people's histories. That is all being told to us by this narrator, who isn't even named, I don't think.
For me, the difference is that the line works is not really about that. This straddles
Right.
the line between fiction and nonfiction. And from what I understand, Sebald does that with his other works as well. So that's a pretty big difference. Like, he uses the same tools to create something completely different.
Right.
And I would like to read more Sebald, especially because I read excerpts of the kind of travel log he wrote, and it's pretty funny. Like, it's very different. So I'm just kind of curious on what it would be like to read a different work by him that is not, really focused on the Holocaust. Like, I'm just curious how he would approach it, because after reading this book, he did it so well that I feel like he's just a depressing writer, or he's someone who only writes in one mode, but it seems like he can write in multiple modes. So I'm just kind of curious. What about you, Eyad? You didn't answer your own question.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely pick up more of his work. As I'd mentioned at the beginning, he died quite young, and he seemed to come to writing fiction later in life.
44. That's when he started.
Yeah, there's not that much out there, but I think it's the kind of thing where it's a satisfying meal, and because it's so satisfying, you don't feel hungry again for a while. So I think I will definitely come back to him, but not immediately. So like maybe after a year.
Okay, we'll conclude here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with our review of this book, you can come let us know on Reddit. That link is below. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Also, if you liked this podcast, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with a more in-depth discussion of Austerlitz. If you're interested in joining that discussion, go ahead and find a copy of the book. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.